Hi there! Welcome back to our Python for Beginners playlist. Previously, we've learned that functions are reusable blocks of code that perform a particular task. And we've learned that all functions need to be defined first before they are called. So in the previous video, we learned about built-in functions. And these are functions that are already created within Python. So we learned how to call them. In today's video, we'll cover how to create our own functions, and then we'll learn more about calling functions. So without further ado, let's begin. To define a function, we always start with the def keyword. That's DEF. This is short for define, and it tells Python to create the function as we're going to specify. Next, we have the function name. And this follows the same rules as our variable names. For example, you cannot have any spaces in the function's name, which is why we have an underscore here. And it's also good to make your function names descriptive. Then after that, we have parentheses. Then we have a colon after the parentheses. The next thing we do is very important. We're going to hit enter on our keyboard. And notice that when we hit enter, the code is automatically indented, and that's 4 spaces. This is where we will write our code, and I'm going to put it as a comment here. Code goes here. So this indentation is what tells Python that the code is within the function or that it's part of this function. Hitting enter is the easiest way to get this indentation, but you can also hit tab and you get the same 4 spaces. So we'll talk more about indentation when we look at an actual example. If the function is not supposed to take any arguments, then we're done. But if it does take arguments, it will have variables called parameters inside the parentheses. So as an example, I'll add 2 parameters in here, par1 and par2, and they're separated by a comma, just like we do arguments. So when you're calling a function, you pass arguments to the function. These arguments are stored in the corresponding parameters so that they can be used within the function. So the code here that you have in the function will use, or at least should use, these 2 parameters. Now let's see an example. We'll calculate the final grades for some students using what we know so far in Python. First, we'll do that without functions and then with functions. So I'll scroll down here so we can see the grading rubric. So this here is the grading rubric. We've got a midterm that's worth 40%, a final worth 60%, and extra credit for 5%. And then we've got different students' grades here. So what we're going to do, just scroll down a little bit. We're going to start calculating this without functions. All right, let's start with student 100. So the midterm is worth 40% and they got 97. Then we'll add 60% for the final and they got 94. And then all in all, I'll divide by 100 so we can get the same percentage here. And let's run that. We got 95.2, which is correct. Now just give us more space there. So let's add this for student 126 as well. So what we have to do here is replace the midterm grade 69 and also the final, that's 77. And this as well, I guess in the comment, 126. But I want to print both of them or display both of these. So I need to use the print function here because Jupyter only prints the last one. So we'll have that there, run it, and we see 95.2 and 73.8. So I'm not going to do this for all of them. You don't need to see this. I'll just copy and paste what I have. All right, now we have all the student grades calculated. We see that student 151 is the only one with extra credit, so we added, the extra credit there. Now let's define a function for this. So first things first, def keyword, And then our function's name, I'll name it final grade. And our parenthesis. So we won't need arguments here because you need to input all the students' different grades, like the midterm grade, and then the final, and also the extra credit. So as I mentioned previously, these parameters are variables, so the same rules apply for how to name them. For example, again, no spaces, we use the underscore. So the next thing is our colon, and then we'll hit enter, and I'll just write out the formula here using the parameters that we have. So I'll print as we were doing, and then it's going to be our 40. That's how much the midterm is worth. And then times midterm, and plus 60 times the final grade. And then plus 5% extra credit times the extra credit grade. There we go. That's our function. So let's run this. So when we run this, nothing seems to happen, and that's okay. That's because all we did was create the function. We didn't actually put anything in. So to actually get it to do something, we need to call it. And just like we did previously with our built-in functions, we just need to put in the different arguments. So we'll have the function's name, final grade, and then parentheses. And then we'll input, for example, for student 100, their grades are, for the midterm, it's 97. And for the final, it's 94. And then for extra credit, they did nothing because, well, those are really good grades. They don't need it. So let's run it. And we get that because we did not divide it by 100. Sorry, my bad. Let's add that in. It's divided by 100. There we go. And let's run the function definition again. And let's run our function call. Now we're getting the right one, 95.2. So if we do this for all the other students as well, we can just copy and paste that. And our grades, I need to see them here, 69 and 77. And we've got both grades, same as above, and I'll just copy and paste the rest of them here. Right, so I just copied and pasted all the other students' grades using the functions, and I, documented it a little bit more here. Let's run it, and we should see the same grades as above, 95.2 and 88, and then the rest. So this is how you create a function with parameters in it. So next, we're going to talk a little bit more about the different components and features of these functions. We'll start with indentation, which is very important syntax in Python. So as I mentioned earlier, indentation tells Python that the code is part of the function. So it's important syntax that also applies to things like conditional statements and loops that we're going to learn later on. So you'll get indentation errors if there's no indentation and if there are different levels of indentation. So I've got an example here where we have no indentation. So we've got a function called wrong indentation. And we've got print function here that's printing 20, but again, there's no indentation. So if we run that, we see the error, indentation error, expected an indentation block after function definition on line 2. Because, you're basically creating an empty function and Python doesn't understand why. So it's not going to do it. It's just going to give you an error. And for the second example, we have different levels of indentation. So the first print function here has the 4 indentation, but this one has 2. So if we run that, it also gives us an indentation error, and it says that the indentation doesn't match, like the inner and the outer level. So what this means is that Python is just not sure what this second print function is supposed to be part of. Now, without running, you can also see that maybe there's some sort of error here, because if you notice, print is now in red instead of I guess that's green here. Yeah, so that's also how you can tell that maybe you have the wrong indentation in there. So the default in Python is 4 spaces, but you can use any indentation you want as long as you have indentation in there. But I would advise you to use the default one because of things like this. If you use different indentation, then you're going to get an error and your program isn't going to run. So I'd recommend always use enter. And even after, like, I've written that print function, print 20, if you hit enter, it's going to give you the exact same indentation as the one above. So this will reduce a lot of errors here. And you can always press tab as well. So I'm just going to remove that indentation there. And if we hit tab, it gives you the exact same indentation as the one above. Now let's look at the return keyword. The return keyword is used when defining functions to return or give us back a specific value. So if the return keyword is not used, then the function returns none. So as we learned previously, none represents nothingness in Python. But what we don't know is that it's also a keyword. All right, so we've mentioned 3 keywords now: def, return, and none. So I'll just quickly define them. So keywords are reserved words in Python that do something specific. For example, we know that the return keyword is used to give us back some data. So one special thing about keywords is that they cannot be overwritten. Like, they're just so important that Python won't even let you mess with them. So if we try to assign a number, for example, to a variable named return, yeah, let's see what happens. Got return. And let's assign 7 to it. Right, we get a syntax error, so it's not going to let you do that. And then lastly, when you have code that has a keyword in it, it's generally called a statement. And we'll see a lot of other keywords and statements later on. So now let's get back to our return keyword. I'll just delete this here. All right, so I'll paste in our final grade function here. Currently in our function definition, we use the print function. And when we learn about built-in functions, we learned that the print function displays its arguments to the screen and returns none. Let's instead use the return keyword, which allows us to store or reuse the results. So for example, if we wanted to calculate the student's GPA after we have our final grade, then we can do that. So I'll change print here to return, and let's do a space there. We don't actually need these brackets because it's a statement just like def. It doesn't need any brackets on there. It's not a function. So we've got that. Let's run it. And then now let's call our function. Hey, so I just pasted what I have here. So we're going to call the function final grade, the new function we just made, and we're storing the returned value in a variable named student100 final. If we run that, let's copy student100 final so we see what's in it. Okay, now we have 95.2 as expected. So now we can use this variable for whatever other calculations that we want to do after this. So the next thing we'll talk about are arguments. So there are 2 argument specific rules that we generally need to follow when we're calling a function. So for example, here you see that we have 3 arguments, and we also have 3 arguments in our function definition. So you need to enter the same number of arguments as defined within the function. And also the order of the arguments should be exactly the same as the order in the function definition. For example, this first one represents the midterm grade, the second one represents the final grade, and the last one represents the extra credit for the student. So you need to follow these rules. Otherwise, if you don't follow the rules, then you get some errors. And let's see what happens. So I'll copy this here, this function call, and I'll just remove the last argument here. And when we run that, it gives us a type error. It says final grade is missing one required positional argument. That's our extra credit. And let's say we have too many arguments. I'll paste it in, and then I'll just add one extra argument, another 0 here. If we run that, and we also get a type error, and it says final grade takes 3 positional arguments, but we gave it 4. So you need to follow that exactly, the same number of arguments as you have defined within the function. And then the last one is the wrong order. So I'll paste again. So this should give us 95.2. But if we have different order, let's say instead we'll start with 94 and then 97 here, 94 and 97. That's going to give us a different score. So this actually isn't that bad. But let's say we had 0 here instead, and then let's do 97 and 94 here. Then they would get a pretty bad grade. So always remember to have the same number of arguments in your function call as in your function definition, and also to keep the same order of arguments in your function call and in your function definition. However, there are exceptions to these rules when you include default parameters and also keyword arguments, and those two are our next topics. So we can set default parameter values when defining a function. So this means that we do not need to pass arguments for these parameters when we're calling it. So if we don't pass arguments, the function will use the default values. And if we do give it arguments, then the function will overwrite those defaults. So this is very useful for arguments that rarely change. So in our example, in our final grade function, which I have on the screen here already, we could make extra credit a default parameter. That's because very few people seem to try to get it. So it's safe to say that most people have it as 0. So it's a very simple change. We're just going to go to the extra credit parameter, and just like with our variable assignment, we'll add equal and then 0. And that's it. Now, when we're calling the function for example, student 100, we can have our function and just their midterm and their final, and that should run without giving us errors. So I do first need to run this to change it. Okay, we've got a function, and then we've got a grade. So now we don't get an error anymore because it's going to default the extra credit to 0. Now, if the student had extra credit, I'll just copy and paste what we have above. Let's say they got 100%, then it would take that instead, which they're doing pretty good. The second rule we had with arguments is that they need to be in the same order as the parameters. However, functions can be called with just the arguments, like the value in the data, as we've been doing here. And these are called positional arguments, or we can specify which parameter the argument is going to be assigned to, and these are called keyword arguments. So when you're using keyword arguments, the order doesn't matter. So for example, here we can use keyword arguments in a way that looks like variable assignment. So I'll say midterm, which is the name of my parameter, and then equal. So you're kind of assigning them when you're calling it. And for the second one, that would be the final grade. Oh, no, sorry, final exam. And the last one is extra credit. Right, if we run that, we get 102. Now, if I copy this and paste it here. And we're going to switch the order. We're going to start with extra credit. So I'll cut that, Control X, Control V, and we need to add a comma in between and remove that comma here. So we're starting with extra credit, and we've got our midterm and our final. That's not the original order of the parameters. If we run that, we get the same thing, 102. So this is one way that you can avoid having to keep the exact same order as the parameters. And that marks the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. Just a little recap. Functions are reusable blocks of code that perform a particular task. Now, with variables, for example, we store data and give it a name that we can use to retrieve that data. However, with functions, we are storing instructions with a name that lets us reuse these instructions with different inputs. And we do so by defining the function using the def keyword, the function name, the parenthesis, and the colon. And don't forget about that very important indentation, because that's the only way that Python knows that this code that you're going to write is within the function. Next, we're going to step up our function game even more to learn about modules and packages. So these are basically external sources of functions, and they are very, very helpful because you can find all sorts of things out there. And we'll learn how to bring them in and use them in our code. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.